immense variety of animals, plants, etc. And in general, a research aim is to reproduce this constant innovation in nature. And one approach would be to use an intrinsic motivation instead of a task-specific objective function. And that's what we are doing in our minimal surprise approach. Another path to achieve this is to have selection pressure for novel behaviors, as in novelty search. And so we focused on if our approach of minimize surprise is competitive to novelty search, considering the generated behavioral diversity. We use a swarm scenario. So we have a torus grid world. It's two-dimensional, and we change the grid size to vary our swarm density. That means we keep a fixed number of 100 agents. It's a homogeneous swarm, so they have the same capabilities, and they get the same controller during evolution. And each agent can see 14 adjacent grid cells. It's binary sensors. That means it gets either a 1 or a 0, indicating that there is another agent or there is none. And it can do one of two actions, which is either moving one grid cell forward, which is prevented when the grid cell is already occupied, or it can turn by plus and minus 90 degrees. So that's the scenario we investigate our research question in. And we compare in total 5 different approaches. I will focus on 4 in this talk due to the time constraints. First, we have a genetic algorithm. It's a baseline and a basis for the other approaches. Then we have our minimize surprise approach and a variant of it, which is called minimize surprise with predefined predictions. I will go into detail in a minute. And last but not least, of course, novelty search. Let's first have a look at the genetic algorithm, because it's the basis for our minimize surprise and for novelty search as well. We use the same parameters for all experiments. The only exception is that we do not use elitism in novelty search. And we run 50 independent runs per scenario. It's just a basic genetic algorithm, and we evolve the weights of a controller, like the robot controller, which is represented by a feed-forward neural network. It gets the current sensor values as input and the action which was done last, and it outputs the next action the robot will do and the turning direction, which are executed in the current time step. And as we ran some experiments as a baseline, experiment 2, we had to decide for a fitness function. So in that case, we randomly chose aggregation and reward the short average distance to the center of robot mass. Then the minimize surprise approach. There we have additionally to the controller a world model, which is represented by second neural network. And it predicts the sensor values for the next time step. We evolve both in pairs, so world model is always paired with the controller, and the fitness is given for the pair. But we only reward the prediction accuracy of the world model, so we have an intrinsic motivation. And that means if we have a high fitness for the world model, then the controller will survive as well. In the minimize surprise with predefined predictions variant, we predefine the predictions. Basically, we override the outputs of the world model and push evolution towards a desired behavior. Here, to match like the genetic algorithm, we said we push for grouping behaviors and define that the robot wants to perceive other agents in all of its neighboring cells. And thus we don't need the world model anymore and can just leave it out, but we still keep the fitness function and compare how good this desired sensor values match with the actual sensor values. And that is somehow a task-related fitness function again. Last but not least, we have novelty search. And as novelty search should produce continually novel individuals, we need to compare behaviors and define what is novel. And therefore, we need to characterize our resulting behaviors and calculate the distance to other individuals, like current population and an archive of past individuals. And to be here a bit domain independent as well, we chose to use the average sensor values of the robots in the last time step and have thus a vector with the normalized sensor values, which can be populated in different ways. So novelty search should come up to different behaviors which lead to different sensor patterns in the last time step. And the distance is then calculated between the different behaviors as the Euclidean distance, and then with the nearest neighbors, we can calculate the novelty score. So which behaviors could come out? We have classification of behaviors based on previous work. And there we found 8 different behaviors. The red line in the different plots are to guide the eye to tell you what is a typical example of one of these behaviors. And the behavior is always judged based on the robot positions in the last time step. We have 3 grouping behaviors, which is aggregation, clustering, and loose grouping, then lines and pairs, and 3 dispersion behaviors, which is triangular lattices, squares, and random dispersion. And here's just a quick example how it could look like that such a pattern forms. Usually it's quite fast. That's a video from previous work, and the YouTube video shows a lot of more examples if you're interested in it. So our results. First, we compared the genetic algorithm and minimize surprise with predefined prediction, because both are somehow task specific. And in both, we aim for grouping behaviors. And that's what we get as well. For the smaller grid, we have in both cases mainly aggregation. That means one big cluster. But for the larger grid, the genetic algorithm still leads mainly to aggregation, but minimize surprise leads more to clustering. And we think that might be caused by the different nature of the fitness function. The genetic algorithm has a global view with rewarding shorter average distances to the center of robot mass. And the minimize surprise has a very local view by providing a template which is based on the sensor values only. In the next step, we compare novelty search and minimize surprise. Both lead to diverse behavior distributions, which we can see by the different colors in the pie charts. But novelty search in general leads to the highest quantity of different behaviors for both grid size. But what we still want to know is which one is more diverse or leads to a more uniform distribution of the 8 possible behaviors, but because that would be somehow very diverse. And we compare that by comparing the behavior distributions to the uniform distribution with the Jensen-Shannon divergence. And we observe on the smaller grid that both novelty search and minimize surprise are similar close to the uniform distribution, but on the larger grid, novelty search is clearly more uniformly distributed than minimize surprise. But what we notice as well is that the different distributions in minimize surprise vary with the swarm density, and it's a significant difference in there. So we check the effect of swarm density in more detail. Here you can see results of runs, which are ranging from like a grid which is 10 times 10, that means 100% swarm density, to a 30 times 30 grid. And it's quite intuitive that the smaller grid sizes lead to grouping behaviors like aggregation. And then we find a shift with the grid size and with the decreasing swarm density to dispersion behaviors on the larger grid. What is noticeable as well is that we find one swarm density which leads to the highest quantity of different behaviors, and which seems to be rather invariant from the swarm density. And that's a 16 times 16 grid. So while we can steer our resulting behaviors in novelty search with our behavioral characteristic, and the swarm density seems only slightly to affect the results, the emergent behaviors in minimize surprise are heavily affected by the swarm density. And thus, by choosing a swarm density, we can push towards different kinds of behaviors in minimize surprise. So to conclude, We have novelty search, which has an explicit driver for diversity, and thus we can find different behaviors and diverse output set of behaviors within one run. In contrast, minimize surprise has no explicit driver for diversity, but due to the intrinsic motivation, we can generate diverse behaviors over several runs. Then we found that minimize surprise and the resulting behaviors in minimize surprise are highly affected by the swarm density, and this is a point which needs some more investigation if we can maybe put the results we generate in this intermediate density, if we can put it on smaller and larger grids and still get our desired behavior. And for future work as well, we want to put the whole approach on real robots. We want to test it on real robots to see if the diversity is still given for both scenarios. And we want to test if we can get more complex behaviors, especially with minimize surprise. So thank you for your attention. I'm open for questions, and yeah, you can contact me in various ways after the talk as well.
Thank you so much. That was great. If folks have questions, they can raise their hand or unmute themselves.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, Tanya, thanks for the nice talk. I was wondering, because there's also been a lot of work recently with this free energy minimization. It's also kind of, yeah, I worked with it a little bit, and the main problem was always like the exploration part, right? Could you, maybe I missed it a little bit, but could you maybe highlight a bit more how your agents are like exploring the possible options that they have?
You mean within one run or in general?
Well, kind of, yeah, kind of in general, like they can do a lot of actions and they all have this effect, right? So yeah. How do they just do actions at random and then converge to some strategy, or is there some some other idea?
We didn't totally look in how it evolves over time, so how it changes, but in general, as it's easier to predict if they have some kind of static pattern they form, or if they change their environment in a way that it's static, or a movement which is like similar all the time. It's easier for them to predict. So probably quite fast converges to behavior where they are very fast in forming a static structure and then just predicting continually the same thing.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much, Tanja. So we're going to move on to our last talk of the session. Imran, I'm going to be playing the video, is that correct?
Yeah,